You're watching France 24 with me, Gavin Lee. We're looking at the life and the legacy of Pope Francis, who died today, age 88. We have Tim Vickery, our correspondent for Latin America in Rio de Janeiro. Great to have you on the programme, Tim. Also, the guests in the studio, we have Vivian Walt, seasoned world correspondent, Paris correspondent for Time magazine, and also Philip Ter, our international affairs editor. Great to have you all here with us. Tim, let's start with you. I hear that the Brazilian president has also announced 7 days of mourning.
Yes, he has. And he's left a very, very effusive message of tribute to Cardinal Bergoglio, Pope Francis, praising his values of love, tolerance and solidarity, always on the side of those in need. Humanity has lost a voice of respect and welcome for the poor. And President Lula goes on to say how much Pope Francis was engaged in the fight to improve the environment, to protect the environment, and also that he criticised with urgency the economic models that, as well as degrading the environment, have caused humanity to produce so much injustice. And it's exactly this kind of social focus that has made Pope Francis quite a divisive figure politically here in South America. Argentina has also declared 7 days of mourning, but the message from President Milei, much less effusive. There have been attempts over recent times of Milei to get closer to the Pope, but as Milei mentions in his tribute, they did have differences. And a few years ago, it's not so long ago, when Milei was on the campaign trail, that he described Pope Francis as an imbecile, as an agent of evil, and as someone who was propagating communism. That view very common on the South American far right. The mentor, the intellectual mentor of a lot of this, the recently deceased Olavo de Carvalho, actually thought that Pope Francis was probably guilty of heresy, and the best thing to do was just ignore him until he passed away, which has now happened. So it's a very divisive Pope Francis in South America, very, very much welcomed by the left. But I don't think it's too far to say actively despised by some on the far right.
Yeah, it's a very difficult area to bridge, isn't it? And we saw, as you just touched upon, with Javier Milei saying that he really deeply respects him and had difficult times with him. I mean, he had said some deep insults, hadn't he? Called him kind of the existence of evil, the epitome of it in the past. But they clearly saying that he said is almost by the by now, that this is not the day to talk or think about that.
No, but the ideas live on, and it'll be very interesting to see which way the Catholic Church goes now. And Bergoglio was never going to have a great deal of time, and maybe the changes have been more in tone than in substance and doctrine. But he does leave a different Catholic Church. He's nominated various cardinals, which means that those who will vote for the next pope, it's a different electorate from those who voted for the last pope, who voted for him in 2013.
It's a very good point to bring on to Philip and Vivian. Stay with us, Tim. It's great to hear your voice on that, which is this, Philip, that the essence and the inspiration and the sort of followings and where those who argue that he was a progressive pope and his movement within the church, whether that can follow on. And there are those that, as we look at the situation now and so familiar with kind of the brutal engineering of when one pope passes on is already this, the other cardinals start to gather at the Vatican and the conclave starts, and they start to consider a new pope. And yet I think I'm right in saying about 3/4 of those cardinals were personally selected by the pope. So that I wonder does he have an influence, therefore, post-life in actually the selection of his successor?
Well, I think as we've been hearing a lot over the day, there is a lot of speculation now that there could be a pope from outside of Europe, possibly from Africa, which we haven't seen before. If you look at the number of popes that there have been over the years, 266 in all, and 217 of those popes have been from Italy. A notable change being Pope John Paul II, who came from Poland. That was the first time. Notable change also with Pope Francis, who came from Argentina, the first pope coming from Latin America. There is a reason to believe that because of all the cardinals that have been appointed by Pope Francis, that we may see a shift away from another pope being coming from Italy this time round, because many of those cardinals have been appointed from overseas. To be exact, 135 or so have been appointed from outside of Italy. So there is, I think, pressure on the Vatican for that reason to name, possibly to elect a pope from outside of Italy. And the second point being that as we've never seen a pope coming from Africa, where there are many young Catholics, this would be a very positive move for the Vatican to have the world's first black pope to be elected to the Vatican. We don't know what's going to happen. Of course, this is up to the cardinals who are allowed to vote. That process is going to start after the mourning period comes to an end, once the funeral of Pope Francis is out of the way. We don't know what they're going to vote, how they're going to vote, whether they are more open to the idea of a younger pope. I think there's also pressure for that to happen, not another elderly man who may give the perception that he's not quite in contact with today's real challenges. And all of these elements together, I think, are going to cause a lot of discussions to take place over the next 2 to 3 weeks before we get that white smoke out of the Vatican to know who is going to be the next pope.
Very interesting, Vivian. We were listening to both to Philip and Tim before, talking about some of Pope Francis's relations with world leaders. We listened about Javier Milei, a patching up of relations at the end. He's always been forthright. It's been uncomfortable even to the likes of President Trump and other populist leaders. And we've seen that very different divide on migration. How do you assess Pope Francis's geopolitics?
You know, in many ways, Pope Francis was, in fact, a politician. Maybe the first pope that we've seen in our lifetimes that was that. It wasn't just that he was forthright about Gaza, which in fact was one subject of his very last speech, the Easter address yesterday, which was read out by an official, not by himself. But he was vocal on so many hot-button issues. He was very forthright that the death penalty was indefensible, a highly divisive issue, obviously, not just in the US, but also in the Middle East and much of Africa. He was condemning of nuclear weapons. I mean, just a vast array of issues. And of course, his feud with Donald Trump was legendary, going back like many years, in fact. When President Trump tried to build the border wall, he said that it was no person who builds walls is an actual Christian. He condemned the mass deportation people as a violation of dignity. He was not afraid to speak out. So he was, in fact, a political leader. Whether the Vatican has the appetite for the next one being that is very uncertain. As Phil says, the smart money at the moment seems to be on an African pope. But that could mean a deeply conservative, traditionally religious pope. It could resemble much more of the pre-Francis popes.
Very interesting, Philip. When you look at some of the way that Vivian described how he framed certain thoughts, arguments. We talked about his thoughts on gay clergy, saying, who is it for me to judge? And that being seen as profound at the moment, that his tone was seen to be progressive. And yet he was kind of signed off on a very, very conservative doctrine. And he talk us through the essence of whether he actually really has any movement when it comes to doctrine.
You know, it's a very difficult situation to manage when you are Pope, because it's a very conservative background, a very conservative institution, and you've got 2,000 years worth of rules that you have to try to reorganize for someone who's probably pretty elderly already and doesn't have an awful lot of time to do it, and probably not an awful lot of leeway either. So what the Pope said was he gave the green light for same-sex couples, but would not condone the idea that they could get married, saying that was something that was decided by God and I cannot go against that. He was not in favour, for example, of women becoming ordained, saying that had already been sorted out by Pope John Paul II, and he would not go back on the decisions that were already made during his papal period. When it came to abortion and to help pregnancies, that was also a no-go area for the Pope. What I think we could say is that, depending on who is in charge, there is some small movement to becoming a little bit more liberal, but only within a very, very small, organised area. What we saw here, there's this big movement to legalise same-sex marriages, same-sex relationships around the world. The Catholic Church has got to move with the times. It can't always stick to the rules that were respected 1,000 years ago. It has to move with the times, otherwise it's going to lose support, and that's something that it cannot afford to do right now. But at the same time, it can't move too far, because if it does, it's going to be seen as forgetting what it stands for and what it's always stood for, and therefore it has to have a limit about just how far it's going to go. And that is the really complicated equation that each pope has got to wrestle with when he takes office. Some popes are a bit more open to changing the rules. I think Pope Francis definitely was someone who was open to that. I think Pope Benedict was not open to that, and probably Pope John Paul II not open to it either. So we have seen a movement. We've seen someone, for example, who has said that the climate is something that has to be very carefully looked after. That was also a first for a pope who's brought that into the fact that climate change is a threat to the world, who's welcomed the internet, saying that the internet was a present given to us by God. That was also a major breakthrough for a pope to say that kind of thing. So the pope has made some changes. There may be small changes, but there are definite changes for the Catholic Church. The big challenge now for the Catholic Church is who is going to take over next, and what kind of changes, if any, will he bring in when he becomes pope.
Very interesting. And the idea of the Catholic Church and the unifier of the Catholic Church is bringing 1.5 billion faithful together at the same time. That's the challenge for the progress. I want to go back to Tim Vickery, and just as we go to Tim in Brazil, I want to update the Vatican's official website has changed in the past few minutes, reflecting the death of Pope Francis. It now reads Apolistica sedes vacans, which means in Latin the seat is vacant. Tim, one thing that people watching the coverage and listening to you, many people around the world will know your encyclopedic knowledge of Latin American football, and probably few might know that the Pope was a huge football fan here, a particular team who've sent tributes today, which is San Lorenzo. Tell us about his perhaps lesser-known sporty links to the club.
Yes, and he was an absolute San Lorenzo fanatic, and I think this has political implications, because what I think he has been more than anything else for the Catholic Church in its relatively short time in charge. I think it's been wonderful public relations. And remember, he took over at a time when I think the Church thought itself that it had suffered too much from stern-faced social and political conservatism, and obviously the scandal of the paedophilia inside the Church. And Pope Francis, he just had this glorious popular touch. He was a master, a genius, I think, at communications. And his love for football was one of the ways that he did that. When he was here in Brazil on, I think it's the first visit, he came out with a line, well, the Pope is from Argentina, but God is Brazilian. Wow. That's genius in terms of public relations. He visited a high security prison in Bolivia, notorious prison in Bolivia. And he said there, I am a sinner too. I could easily have ended up like one of you. And that use of the popular touch, and football, I think, was very much a natural part of this strategy, because he was a fanatic of San Lorenzo, who became, for the first and only time, champions of South America shortly after he became Pope, there with a little bit of divine intervention. But I think this was all part of this public relations masterstroke, where he has managed to change the tone. Obviously, as your wonderful guests have been saying, there's limited amount of scope you have to move in something like the Catholic Church, because it's so old and it's trying to keep so many people on the same arc. But in terms of tone, I think the whole tone of the Catholic Church now looks far more healthy than it did at the time when he was appointed some 12 years ago.
And trying to give a sense of the man before becoming Pope, Tim, Jorge Bergoglio, growing up in Buenos Aires. I don't think there's any documented evidence, although he watched football a lot, that he actually played football himself. But just tell me what's known about his beginnings, his early life, growing up in Flores, I think, in the barrio, the neighbourhood of Buenos Aires.
That's it, in the neighbourhood of San Lorenzo. When he became Pope, one coach who'd been a coach of San Lorenzo back in the 80s said, "Oh God, I remember him coming down as a priest and trying to get into the dressing room, and I always kicked him out. Maybe I'll be in for excommunication now." I think very significant with the life of Bergoglio is that he was the child of very recent immigrants. His parents immigrated from Italy. Only just a few years before he was born. And I think the whole issue there of immigration, because of his family background, was very, very dear to his heart. One of the first things he did there was to visit the ports where so many Italians moved to the New World in search of a better life. And we've seen that in the conflict there with Donald Trump, with this idea that if you're more interested in building walls and bridges, you cannot be a Christian. So this stand that he took on behalf of immigrants, on behalf of the excluded, I think that has done a great deal to change the tone of the Catholic Church over the last 12 years. So I think his personal biography as the son of immigrants is a key part to understanding his empathy with people in a similar situation.
I'm minded to ask, as a sideshow to all of this, but I think there will be people who would be interested. Many people see one of the greatest Argentinian footballers, Maradona. Did the two ever meet?
No, I don't think they did. He's met Messi, and he made a vow, the Pope, never to watch television. So one of the duties of his staff was to keep him updated. They had to compile quite lengthy reports on every game that San Lorenzo played. And that was the way that Pope Francis, Cardinal Bergoglio, kept in touch with the team that he grew up supporting.
Wow, Tim, a pleasure to talk to you, our correspondent in Brazil.